Okay, all right. Hello, I can do my pitch voice. Hi, I'm Damon Hart Davis from Open TRV. Allow me to sell you something. So, actually, the previous talk is entirely relevant. I am just turning. The register just asked me to write this up for them, and so I wrote the draft and the train up here. But I am just turning what was a hobby a couple of years ago. Well, I had a sort of epiphany in 2007. I thought, oh, I could stop wasting quite so much energy. And since then, it turned into a hobby, and then I became a bit of an expert, and I discovered, like, the energy department was contacting me for data and stuff. And in the last year and a half, we created an open source group, and now actually I'm going to stop doing my well-paid contract to the bank to do this more or less full-time. So it's exactly at this stage that you're talking about. And oh boy, yes, I'm sure we do get lots of things wrong, and I'll be reminded of it. So the aim of this is to save the planet while not getting too poor. So it's carbon reduction done right. There's our Twitter if you want to follow us. One of the things I discovered about energy efficiency is there are an awful lot of what the marketing people will call low-hanging fruit. There's an awful lot of things that can be done that are really simple and make a really huge difference. They don't really need to be sexy or have smartphones or require anyone to program. So there's things like changing a light bulb. So you know that something like 60% of the light bulbs in the UK are still incandescent. You know, it's just ridiculous. That's huge amounts of savings that can be done. And people would, of course, be saving money if they threw away the old ones and put in LEDs now. But they won't do it. And the one that I'm addressing here is heating. So by a long series of things, the just gone out, the guy who's just left as the chief scientist at the Department of Energy, David McKay, wrote a book on sustainable stuff without the hot air. And we'd had a chat about stuff before, and I got invited at some point to give a presentation about smart heating at the Department of Energy, and I did a bit of research, and it was clear that there were a bunch of sort of things you could do to smarten your heating at home if you weren't going to do it all yourself. But they were all proprietary and expensive, and they wouldn't interoperate, and didn't do the most basic things, of which there were two. One is zoning, only heating the bits you actually need to heat. I mean, how difficult is this? And the other one is telling when someone's in the room. And I'd remembered 15 years ago and seen something in RS catalogue that was a set-back thermostat, which if there was no one in the room would drop the temperature degree. Could I find it? No. So in this meeting I said, the really sad thing is that no one does zoning and occupancy in the same package, and you can't combine any two of those things. And the chap from a nameless, very famous big company called Honeywell, said, oh, we'll get you all that, don't worry about it, I'll get you the stuff and you can play with it after the presentation. Except it never turned up. And it turned out it didn't really exist. And this is the kind of spawn of a good idea, I think, when you think, wow, that's so simple, it's not rocket science. Here's a real itch that needs scratching, and I can scratch. And I think that is the genesis of a good idea, and that's what we're doing here. So here's the old joke. Half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is I don't know which half. It's not a joke that it's still the case that your average homeowner has the same problem with his space heating bill or hers. From our experience, roughly half what people are spending on their space heating is quite unnecessary. So people complain about their energy bills, they could halve them at a stroke. Allow me to sell you a dozen of these. Many of you will have these things in your house. Thermostatic radiator valves, that's what the TRV stands for. Mechanical ones, really nice idea. They save lots of energy because rather than trying to balance your radiators mechanically, to get about the right amount of heat in each room, you set something which is a temperature roughly, and it maintains the room at that temperature, which is excellent. In fact, it's such a good, simple idea, and these things are so cheap that it's actually mandatory in all the different UK building codes to have thermostatic radiator valves. You have to have them. But it's a bit of a tragic system in the sense that we have very poor housing stock which loses lots of heat. And the way it works is you put a thermostat in the coldest bit of your house, or if you're building a new house, you have two zones, but you have two thermostats in the coldest bit of the house, which switch your boiler on if any of the rooms might need heat, which means at the least you're running a circulation pump all the time when you don't need to allow these to let the hot water in when you actually do need heat in a room. So the solution to that is a slightly smarter one. Here was the one you got up there. That was our revision 1. This is revision 2. You replace this thing with something a bit smarter. And the key change here, the zoning change, is that each one of those emits a little signal saying, oh, we need heat in this room. And if any one of those, but only if any one of those is asking for heat, does the boiler come on? Dead simple. I mean, you know, any commercial building of any size at all is zoned. No one would, well, mind you, I went into a local authority one where they do have one thermostat in the whole building, which means everything is baking. And I've complained twice to their sustainability person. They're thinking about maybe getting around to thinking about having a committee. But anyway, any sensible building is already zoned. So you can do it for your own house. And so our little thing is you have one of these controlling each radiator, and I can give you details later. If anyone's interested, we'll have a workshop tomorrow, incidentally, where you can build one of our units if you want to. Where you only run the boiler if you actually need it, and the other thing is to only run it in the rooms where you need it. Most people in this country, 60% of all your energy bill goes towards space heating, and most people admit to leaving heating on in rooms where there's no one there. And actually, we claim you can save about 50%, and we've actually borne this out with we've had some trials smaller than I'd like, but there's some dramatic graphs which I can show people afterwards, which you see someone puts in us. So here's the graph of actual heat requirement because of temperature, and his gas demand was fitting right up underneath this. He installs our system, boom, half. Took it out, because I managed to blow up his boiler. We won't talk about that bit. Back up. Back up to hit the top. You know that thing about accepting criticism, you know? Yeah. And he puts it back in and zoom, down again, half like that. I sent that to the chief scientist and said, I haven't got you the numbers yet, but look at that and tell me this isn't worth having. Okay, and the aim is that this will cost you a tenner a radiator. Okay, so we're talking really cheap, a whole house for 100 quid. There's 17 billion pounds a year, I think, spent on space heating in the UK. We can save 6 billion a year if everyone puts one of these in their house. There we go. In fact, look, I've even got my numbers right. And more pertinently, because I'm after saving the planet, 20% of all the UK's carbon emissions are space heating at home, space heating homes. We could knock 10% off the entire UK's carbon emissions if everyone had one of these. And the number's very similar for the whole of Europe. The saving will be 8% for the whole of Europe. And because we're being funded by we've had some funding from a European-oriented body, we now talk about the EU, not just the UK. What we don't expect is people to program them. We don't expect people to get plumbers and electricians in. We don't expect people to reconfigure their entire heating system. So whatever it is that we're going to do, if it's going to get wide adoption, has to be retrofit. In other words, you've got to be able to knit down Maplins or B&Q, buy a shrink wrap box with a bunch of these things and install it yourself. And that's what our technology allows. And just to be clear, we're right at the end of this process in a way. While I've still got the day job, we are hoping within 2 months to actually have the fully production engineered thing ready. So we've got working prototypes, but somebody is at this moment in Norwich slaving over a hot computer, getting things like, so we've got 3D printed boxes here, but they're doing proper injection molded boxes and stuff for us. So, you know, 20 million homes, you can work out the numbers, but anyway, here's this big number. We could halve that. So all this complaining about energy bills being too high, right. Most people heat empty rooms. So what we're aiming for, really, ideally, it's being pointed out that what you don't want to do is heat the house. You want to keep the people warm in it. All right, you don't want your clothes to rot or get, you know, mildew on them. But apart from that, really, you want a cozy, warm bubble of heat that's following you around. And there's some very fancy solutions now, like infrared lasers that actually target you and keep you warm. Well, we're not quite that clever. Not for a tenner a room, we're not. So this isn't rocket science. And indeed, because our aim is to get maximum adoption, we are, well, we're possibly mad. Our aim is to give everything away. So all our stuff is published under an Apache license, or, thank you, Andrew, a solder pad, for example, for the hardware. Even the box design is given away. Because what we're hoping is that someone in China will attempt to, in quotes, rip us off by making hundreds of thousands of these things far cheaper than we possibly could. And indeed that people like Honeywell and Heatmiser and so on will say, oh yes, our thing is Open TRV compatible, which means you can then safely go and buy anything which have an Open TRV stamp in the same way that if you buy something with a Wi-Fi stamp on it, you know it's going to work. I had a fascinating, we Open TRV won a competition, well, it came third in competition, but it won a prize from British Gas called Connecting Homes. And we went to chat to them afterwards, and their system, Hive, the radio alone in their radiator control units cost more than our entire controller. And so we said, well, you know, we could bridge our stuff onto yours, and it'd be much cheaper, and we could give you the stamp of compatibility. You know, so here I am, a one or two person entity with an open source project, going to British Gas and say we could give you a stamp of authenticity, and they were really keen. It was just amazing. But you know, those are quite powerful, positive messages for consumers as well, that they won't have to chuck it all out next year. So what are we doing? Zoning, I've described a bit. The point is that heat each room on its own merits. Occupancy sensing. So this does a simple thing. Lots of people, I mean, so for our kids, I used to go upstairs half an hour before they went to bed, turn up the TRV, then I had to fiddle with the heating to make sure it came on, let their rooms get warm, and then turn it down when we went upstairs again. Well, most people in the UK will simply not spend that much effort on their heating. I think it's fairly clear. So there are a couple of approaches to that. This thing has two little buttons on the side. You can set a program. So what would happen without having any flashing 1200s on here? For my kids, I go up half an hour before they want to go to bed at the normal time. I press this button, and it remembers and will bring the thing on for an hour, then every 24 hours thereafter. Now, I think many people would allow that level of interaction. It's a button you press once, and that's the end of it. The other thing is that if it detects you're not in the room, and it's pretty crude at the moment, it's just ambient light, so if it's too dark for you possibly to be doing anything other than sleeping, it drops the target temperature by a degree.